Welcome back to the hard to believe to the final session of this conference on Jefferson versus Madison. The last couple of days have gone by very quickly, I think. And let me, in advance of this session, thank this great panel, this great group of panelists for making my job so easy. In fact, I've got so many leftover questions because I only had to ask about one question per session. And I had dozens for each session, but this has been great. I appreciate the discussion we've had since Jefferson said in his notes in Virginia that man is an imitative animal. I think meetings like this are important because they show the possibilities of civil conversation, and that to me is something that is lacking. One of the things lacking in our society today is to engage with people who one disagrees with in a way that you can learn from them and appreciate them. And this has been an exemplary meeting in that regard, so thank you all. And thank you all for being with us for the last 3 days. This session we have all kinds of questions. Bob has provided us with a page full of questions, and I'm going to turn to some of those. But I had a few issues I wanted to raise, but I'm also going to, and later we'll hear from you all, but I'm going to encourage panelists to, you don't have to make an assertion, but if you've got something you'd like to hear your co-panelists talk about, feel free to put your own questions on the table in this final session. This is our last chance as a group to engage in these things. So just one of Bob's questions dealt with the religious views of Jefferson and Hamilton. And so just a couple of places, if we were interested in talking about Hamilton's religious views that we might look is from the first session, his view on the French Revolution, in which he talks about the destruction of religion and the destruction of society. Another place, looking at it more positively, would be his draft of Washington's farewell address. And in just one question concerning Jefferson is the ban in his draft constitution for Virginia, his ban on ministers of the gospel serving in the General Assembly, and how that meshes with his views on the free exercise of religion. One thing we never got to yesterday afternoon because our discussion on slavery was so interesting, but it would have been one of my next questions had we got to my second and third questions, was Jefferson, in a number of letters, said that he liked a little rebellion now and then. It was good for the body politic. And in the first session, we had a letter to Madison. In the second session, we had the letter to Abigail Adams. But the longest statement regarding this was in his letter to William Stevens Smith, reflecting on Shays' Rebellion. And so I just want to read a little bit of that. God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. The people cannot be all and always well informed. The part which is wrong will be discontented in proportion to the importance of the facts they misconceive. If they remain quiet under such misconceptions, it is lethargy, a forerunner of death to the public liberty. We have had 13 independent states, independent 11 years. There's been one rebellion. That comes to one rebellion in a century and a half for each state. What country before ever existed a century and a half without a rebellion? And what country can preserve its liberties if the rulers are not warned as to fact from time to time that the people preserve their spirit of resistance? Let them take up arms. The remedy is to set them right from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. And finally, just to repeat a question I asked this morning about the Kentucky resolution. In Jefferson's mind, did the Kentucky resolution represent what he thought the states had adopted in adopting the Constitution? And if that was his view, was he correct in holding that view that that's what the states had done? Complicated question, I'm sorry. So with that, the queue is open. Peter.
Well, you gave us a lot of questions, and I'd like to talk about that crazy Smith letter. I've always loved it. The calculations 1 out of 143, and it does seem nutty. And people go after Jefferson. He invites incredulity on many occasions when he invites, in the famous Adam and Eve letter, let the whole world drown in blood, just so long as there's an Adam and Eve left in every country. It's easy to criticize him. But I think there's another way to read this, which is what I'd like to suggest, and to spring off something that Colleen said earlier, and I'd like to hear more conversation about public opinion and the notion of the public, which I think are really central to us now, and we can, as she suggests, discover the origins of conceptions of public and public opinion then. A striking place in which Jefferson talks about the voice of the people, and of course this is a voice that Hamilton was not eager to listen to, is in his letter to Kirkeville in 1816 that we've mentioned before. And this is where he opens up his ideas of the ward republic, his extreme version of federalism. And this is in 1816. He's writing it's in the context of the revision of the Virginia Constitution that never takes place because, as you've heard, he never thought Virginia got it right. And so this is the thing that the germ of irritation that keeps him thinking about constitutions and politics. And I think in many ways he's gone a long way from thinking about how to construct the federal constitution because he's much more interested in federalism. But the argument for the word republic is, I think it's a striking one. Nobody in Jefferson's time would think it a good thing to bring a lot of people together and stir them up. As Hamilton would have it, demagogues will take advantage of crowds. Enthusiasm is a very negative term, and it usually refers to religious excesses of people, true believers. People going crazy, out of control. And this is the major argument against democracy, that the people are, as, what are some of the terms? Beast? That wasn't Hamilton, never said they were a beast. What's the worst thing he ever said about the people?
Gouverneur Morris said they were a reptile.
Reptiles, Gouverneur Morris said.
Not Hamilton.
Not Hamilton, that's a canard, I'm sorry, I take that back. And Jefferson wouldn't disagree with this. In Notes in the State of Virginia, he talks about cities as being an equivalent to cancers or cankers on the body politic. They're bad places precisely because shiftless people, unattached people come together and they're easily swayed. The extreme antithesis of the city is a dispersed population across the countryside in the imagined farms that he's putting all his citizens on, the idealized image of the yeoman farmer. And it's in the Kirkeville letter he talks about how we could hear the public speak by, in effect, dividing them and subdividing them down to the lowest level of the plantation or the farm, but then gathering them together in wards or villages. This is where Jefferson is accused of having New England town envy, It was, of course, when people talked about democracy in the early period, and Tocqueville is famous for his account of ground-level village democracy. But what this does is to disaggregate the people, to spread them out, you might say, to diffuse them across the land, and then find structures within which their will can be registered and then reported up the level of jurisdiction to the top. This strikes me as a really interesting dimension of his democratic thought. This is the most extreme version of Jefferson and participatory democracy, but it's one in which the voice of the people is collected and aggregated, mediated, you might even say, in ways that render it more reasonable. He doesn't want Shays' rebellion to repeat, but he thinks that those energies could be contained and diffused if governments were working effectively at every level. This idea of thinking about the republic from the ground up and popular participation and ways to regulate that participation and to avoid anarchy. Jefferson is no different from Hamilton in fearing the dangers of anarchy. So that's probably not a response to anything you asked, Steve, but there it is.
Andrew.
I want to pick up the question about Alexander Hamilton and religion, and particularly the passage in the farewell address that was mentioned. And Hamilton, who ghostwrites Washington's farewell address in 1796, writes, "Can we in prudence suppose that national morality can be maintained in exclusion of religious principle?" And what's interesting is that Washington initially plans to step down in 1792, and he asked James Madison to write a farewell address. And in Madison's version, he doesn't say anything about religion. And then in 1796, when Washington turns to Hamilton and he gives him a draft of Madison's address, which Hamilton largely discards in typical Hamiltonian fashion, and instead writes up this new address, and here we see this passage about religion. And I think this raises a couple interesting questions, which is, one, why is Hamilton talking about religion? And I had a chance to talk with some Hamilton students about this last spring when I visited the AHI. Without question, the French Revolution is a deep concern of Hamilton's, and so in part he's writing in reaction to that. But there are also ways in which this sentiment that civic and religious ends can't and shouldn't be so readily divorced from each other is entirely consistent with Washington's views earlier. If you look at 1785, the potential tax in Virginia that doesn't end up getting passed that's going to allow for taxpayer funds to support religious schools and prompts this vehement opposition from Madison, George Washington goes on record saying, "I don't really have a problem with people paying taxes for that which they profess, to support that which they profess," but he says Jews and Muslims and other religious dissenters need to be exempt from that. And so Washington reconciles this religious pluralism with the belief that government can support religion, and I guess so. If I could take up the option of posing a question to my fellow panelists, and I'd be particularly interested to hear if Colleen has thoughts on this. Are there conversations between Washington and Madison on religion, and why does Madison, who's so centrally concerned with the question of religion and religious freedom and has the opportunity to say something about religion in the farewell address in 1792, opt not to discuss that topic? And does that tell us something about a distance between Madison and Washington when it comes to questions about the politics of religion?
Annette, then Joanne.
Well, both Jefferson and Hamilton, and I know more about Jefferson than Hamilton, understood that they were in a country where religion mattered. Whatever their own individual views about them, that religion was important. They both speak the language of religion. And Jefferson, of course, very famously, creates his own Bible by cutting up the Bible and taking out all the miracles. And it just didn't happen. It just didn't happen, you know. Jesus never said these things. To create a document that would be appropriate for a Republican society. So religion whether it's about personal belief, he didn't believe in the divinity of Jesus, certainly. He understood that his countrymen took these matters very, very seriously, and he wanted to create something that would be usable for them. Hamilton, and Joanne can tell me if I'm wrong, I would imagine would also understand the importance of religion in society and would speak the language of religion as a way to be persuasive to the audience. You tend to your audience, and they both understood that was important. And certainly after the French Revolution, that became a political matter for, it's a subject of politics. It would make sense that he would address that and stand up for the notion of religion or invoke religion in the farewell address as a political matter as much as anything that would have to do with his personal beliefs. But that's just my supposition. But for Jefferson, it's clear that religion provides an understanding of stability for people. It was something that was important, and he uses those words and uses religious terminology in ways that are instrumental. I don't want to say that he's trying to deceive anybody, but it's not tied to his own, always tied to his own personal beliefs.
Joanne, and then Doug.
Oh, that was a handy segue, because I did want to talk about religion, and particularly Hamilton's kind of pragmatic feelings about it as a political force. You know, we've been talking about these people and their politics on different levels. So we've been talking on a level of ideals, we've been talking on a level of policies. We haven't so much talked on a level of politics. And as far as religion is concerned, Hamilton's really interesting on this front, particularly after the Federalists lose the election of 1800. He writes this lengthy letter, which everybody then ignores, but it's a really interesting letter because he says, okay, what did the Republicans do that worked so well for them that we didn't do? And he writes, you know, Republicans are great at appealing to the people's vanity, and he has all capital letters, vanity. But he then clearly is trying as a pragmatic politician to devise a Federalist equivalent. And he proposes creating what he calls Christian constitutional societies. And he very clearly looks at the Republicans and says, okay, they got themselves all excited about the French Revolution. Their emotions were bound up in it. The people were riled up. The French Revolution grabbed people. We can use Christianity the same way and kind of put the Constitution in there too. And we can get the same kind of popular engagement and popular involvement. I think he's being pragmatic. I don't think he's being necessarily dismissive of religion, but I do think he does understand that it has political uses and is a political force, and kind of like what Annette was suggesting, you know, when you look in the farewell address, the word religion is always linked with morality, religion and morality, religion and morality. He sees that as a guiding force or a governing force, kind of in the way that he sees any institution channeling human passions. And I think that's part of how he's thinking about
room has been silenced.
All right.
Oh,
Can you hear me
I'm sorry.
now?
Well, this is working out perfectly because, no, I don't mean the mic.
Hang on a second. Let me read the list. Doug, Carson, Kevin, John, Regasta, and Michael.
Building on what Annette and then Joanne said, I do think that you can read Hamilton and see this I think, a pretty calculated, utilitarian, pragmatic use of religion for political ends. And I think the Christian Constitutional Society is Exhibit A for that. And it's interesting because, the whole idea is that we have to write more pamphlets, but the end will be to elect fit men. So it goes back to this notion of I'm going to use these democratic tools to reach my elitist ends. But what I've always been struck by is how in his personal writings. His religion is this very dark, the death of when Philip gets killed in the duel, and he writes to Benjamin Rush, he was truly a fine youth, but why should I repine? It is the will of heaven, and he is now out of the reach of the seductions and calamities of a world full of folly, full of vice, full of danger. And then a little bit right before the Christian, when he writes to Elizabeth in March 1803, he says, "Arm yourself with resignation. We live in a world full of evil. In a later period of life, misfortunes seem to thicken round us, and our duty and our peace both require that we should accustom ourselves to meet disasters with Christian fortitude." And then, of course, in one of the last letters he writes to Eliza, right before the duel, he says, "The consolations of religion, my beloved, can alone support you, and these you have a right to enjoy. Fly to the bosom of your God and be comforted." So that religion becomes this kind of way of dealing with a world of evil and of loss and of death. And again, it kind of, that famous portrait of Hamilton that we see more and more lately in those last couple of years, he doesn't look like the guy that we tend to see. He's not that guy on the $10 bill. He's this dark and depressed, and that religion becomes this dark comfort. And again, it kind of goes back to this notion of a guy out of time, out of sync with this world around him, and that religion becomes the means by which he's comforted, and he tries to get his wife to be comforted as well. So it's kind of it's an interesting thing. He's on the one hand still trying to utilize it as a political tool to build up the party and to build up his cause, but in his personal life, it's becoming this solace of a bitter man, seeing a bitter and dark world.
Carson, then Kevin.
I'll say a little more about Hamilton and religion. We talked about kind of the middle and the end, or near the end. You've got the Washington farewell address where he talks about the importance of religion to sustaining morality, the personal side that Doug was just talking about, but also it's present at the very beginning in The Farmer Refuted. He does invoke, I believe, God as a necessary foundation for the rights doctrine. In dealing with Seabury, who's the farmer that he's refuting, he says, "You said that in the state of nature there is no law to which man is subject. That's because you're a disciple of Hobbes and an atheist. And anybody who knows the truth about these things knows that there is a supreme being and you are subject to laws, and that's why there are rights in the state of nature." I think Hamilton, at least he said that at the beginning. On the other, I think there's an interesting difference too between Hamilton and Jefferson on where you get the religion necessary for a free and decent society. My impression of Jefferson, although I will defer to those who know a lot more, is that he sort of suggests that an enlightened mind will be able to perceive the principles you need, the moral principles, for a free and decent society. You need enlightenment, you need educated people. I think Hamilton viewed the morality you need for a decent society as an inheritance that has to be protected. There's some of the disputes between them over something as kind of mundane as credit and debt and faith, public faith. He says what I think is kind of a telling remark at one time. Hamilton says, if we're going to do what these Jeffersonians want to do, we'll have to unlearn maxims of morality that have existed for thousands of years, right? So like unravel this inheritance all the way back to the beginning. Hamilton is not exactly a Burkean, but there are some Edmund Burkean strains in him when he says things like that. One final thing I'll just note, because I find it interesting, although I can't tell you what it means. Andrew could maybe tell us more. There's this little short piece by Hamilton called Meditation on the Jews, I think, where he says, history of the Jewish people is outside all the ordinary laws of human history. Might we not think that there is an extraordinary cause matched to this extraordinary effect? That's kind of a theological speculation, right? That's not just a utilitarian invocation of religion to prop up morality, but he's thinking, if God intervened in human history, what would it look like? Maybe like that. I think he's kind of entertaining it there, even though he doesn't appear to be an ordinarily, conventionally church-going person.
Kevin, then John Ragasta.
I think that the radically distinct dispositions of these two men have to be traced to their earliest experiences. So, famously, On one side, Jefferson is the bluest of Virginia blue bloods. He's leisured. He has nothing to fear. He has everything to hope and needn't count on anyone. His approach to the world is to exploit this by developing his own intelligence, by employing it to master such a broad range of different areas of inquiry as just to be baffling. What this leads him ultimately to do is to decide that whatever major area might come to mind, it's possible for him to excel beyond people who've come before. And one conceit that he applies commonly is to say, well, anyone can do this. Anyone can do this. The people can come to understand things as he. So you think about the wards, for example, or his approach to the Bible. Just imagine that in his context. The way he thinks about the people, it's going to be a new people. What kind of people will it be? It'll be millions of Jeffersons. It'll be people who all have the same idea of what's good, true, and beautiful, because, of course, what Jefferson thinks is good, true, and beautiful is what any well-honed mind will conclude about those most important questions. He's going to implement a just visionary, in the most pejorative sense, foreign policy in the middle of a world war in which America is bound to be buffeted. His response is going to be, we should substantially disarm the country. His attitude about the U.S. and Virginia constitutions, well, when it comes to the Virginia Constitution, it's utterly imperfect. And one can't help but suspect that the reason he's so convinced that it's utterly imperfect is that the Convention of 1776 didn't take advantage of the opportunity to use his draft constitution as a template. So whatever attribute of the Virginia Constitution comes to mind over time, he's going to criticize, and criticize just harshly. Education, he's going to think in the most radical way should be remade, and it's not just remaking it, it's changing the basic, or it's eschewing the basic idea on which education has always been founded for the few who could afford it, that older people knew more than younger, and so could decide what, in general terms, younger people needed to be taught, and then could instruct them. Jefferson's attitude is each man knows what he needs to know, and so should have access to a banquet of intellectual riches of which he could partake from time to time, when he has free time, as everyone will, somehow. Beginning in the 1790s, he mocks the idea that our fathers knew more than we, and all the way to the end of his life, 30-odd years later, he's still in correspondence with John Adams saying, well, we had two parties, one of which said that on the major questions our fathers knew what needed to be known, and the other of which said, no, they didn't. That's somewhat amazing. On the other hand, Hamilton's born with nothing, and yet exploits opportunities in a way that's, again, baffling. It's astounding. So he ends up in his minority being responsible for a large business enterprise. A very successful man thinks leaving him in charge of this large business enterprise is a good idea, which is hard to fathom. I think of him, I'm an Army brat, so I've grown up with people like this. I think of him as somebody who's very practical and not very much ideological at all. And actually, if you think of people in American history who've been first generals and then presidents, none of them was ideological. Grant, Eisenhower, Washington, they're all like Hamilton, except he's the smartest. So, well, he is. As far as he's concerned, how do you know what you need to know about democracy? Well, what's the history of democracy? That seems an obvious answer. Jefferson would hate that answer. How about fiscal matters? What do we know about what makes a state successful? Well, one way to figure out how a state might be successful would be to ask oneself, which is the most successful state in existence, and what does that state do? Okay, so Britain is the answer, and the British model is an obvious one to try to adapt to American circumstances. This idea of a Christian constitutional society is just so ham-fisted. But on the other hand, you can see, again, this practical, all right, the people are this kind of a people, how can we appeal to them? It's for their good. And I don't think Hamilton's trying to advance himself. If he were trying to advance himself, he wouldn't behave the way he does. He wouldn't have his project. He wouldn't want the office he wants. He'd be a different person. He's entirely patriotic, but he thinks of America as being a particular place at a particular point in history, and we should adapt it to this situation. We should exploit its assets to make it as successful a new improved British state and society as it could be. This seems to me perfectly practical, which is not a word you recall I used in reference to the other guy. So Doug said, well, that Hamilton had elitist ends. In what sense did he have elitist ends? He thought the elite should govern in a sense. But like Jefferson, Jefferson thought that the average Joe just predictably would pick the best people to govern, and actually, freakishly, this is kind of what had happened in Virginia over time. But Hamilton had to operate on the assumption that ultimately, most of the time, the people would choose well, because what else could you do in a Republican society? But it seems to me that Hamilton's approach, again, is reasonable. It's what you'd expect from somebody who was not born to sit under a tree all day and read Greek while other people were doing the work for him. It's somewhat amazing that the two of them should be in Washington's cabinet at the same time, and I think it's completely unsurprising that they end up at loggerheads. And yet, it's interesting that, as has been mentioned earlier, at the end of his life, Jefferson does concede that, well, Hamilton actually didn't have selfish impulses. He wasn't guided by overweening ambition, as, say, Jefferson insisted Burr had been. Yeah, so it seems to me that Hamilton is a classic kind of a conservative, and Jefferson is a very unusual kind of he uses the word progressive, but he's a radical. I think there's really no other way to end up characterizing him. He's a radical.
Let me read the list, make sure I've got everybody. John Ragasta, Michael, John Bowles, Annette, and Peter.
I'll come back to the radical issue. I want to pick up, though, with religion. Annette points out, and I think it's correct, both Jefferson and Hamilton understand that you're dealing with a country which has a lot of religious people, and therefore religion is going to be a force in society. But the real difference, and certainly for Jefferson and Madison, the question is, what role does government have in that religion? That it's generally talked about in the 18th century. People will say that religion promotes morality, morality is good for government, and then people will conclude, therefore, government needs to promote religion. And Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison say no, that's a mistake. Not only is it a violation of natural rights, but it doesn't work, that if government interferes in religion, it will corrupt both government and religion will be interfered with. So it's that question of how you use it. And I don't think Washington endorses the general assessments in 1784. In fact, he says, I wish this hadn't happened. I wish this hadn't been brought up. I don't think this is a good idea because people are going to be upset with government's engagement in religion. But no, I'm not personally opposed to the idea that you should have to support religion that you claim to be a member of. And I think, by the way, Joanne is implicitly referring to this syllogism of religion promotes morality, morality promotes religion. But in terms of application, then look at the election of 1800. And the lesson that Hamilton draws is, gee, we need a Christian Constitution society. And the reason he draws that conclusion is because religion had been a huge issue in the election of 1800. Jefferson is pummeled in the press, and especially because of the notes on the state of Virginia, the statement that it matters not if my neighbor believes in 20 God or no gods, it neither breaks my, neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. And he's just pummeled for being an atheist, for being irreligious. People say, Adams says, I lost that election because people were afraid that I was going to create a government interference with religion. And I think Adams understands better than Hamilton does. The Jeffersonian response is fascinating. When you read the newspapers and you read the pamphlets, they occasionally will say, well, no, you've got Jefferson all wrong. He's really a religious guy. And he's just as religious as John Adams. I mean, one of my favorite, these newspapers, he's as much a good Christian as John Adams. Now, that's an interesting statement because there's two different meanings to that. But mostly what the Democratic Republicans say is, this is none of your business. That what Jefferson really stands for is government shouldn't be engaged in religion, and that his statement about 20 gods and no God is absolutely correct, that, the separation of church and state is really critical. And that's what ultimately is accepted. I think Adams understands that and Hamilton doesn't. I want to come back, though, as I said, Kevin's radical statement, because I think it goes to something Peter was saying, and that I think we might want to touch on more. Peter talks about the Adam and Eve letter and the bloodbath. Let's put some more modern meat onto that. I mean, we were talking about this over lunch. Timothy McVeigh, Oklahoma City, Blood for the Tree of Liberty. He's wearing a Jefferson t-shirt when he's arrested. Andrew Breivik, the nutcase that goes into the shore in Norway and shoots up a young youth camp. 69 young people died because he wants to create a race war, blood for the Tree of Liberty. That's why he's doing this. Clive Bundy's people, when they're out there talking about shooting federal agents who come to enforce federal law, blood for the Tree of Liberty. This radicalism that people take from Jefferson is used, and I think improperly, in a potentially very dangerous way. And I think Peter's on to the critical point that Jefferson believed that if you could participate in government, and that's why the wards were the ultimate way to participate, that if you participate, then you have no right to revolution. The right to revolution exists when you don't have the right to participate. That's what's going on in 1776, 1775. And this is why the Alien and Sedition Acts, and Annette's point from earlier, that they're deeply afraid of what's going on when you start jailing newspaper editors, because you're going to destroy the right to participate in the polity. Because if people don't understand what the government's doing wrong, then you can't participate. So the Jefferson, he is radical. He says things that seem crazy in isolation, but I think that it's all about what he says in his inaugural address when he says, look, this is the strongest country in the world. This is the strongest country in the world because the people of this, not because we have the strongest military, but because the people of this country understand that they're part of the country. They participate in the country. And that's what gives it the strength. So Jefferson's radicalism, which is abused, I think, terribly in modern times, is caveated by the issue of participation in the polity.
Michael, and then John Bowles.
Yeah, thanks. Just a brief comment about what John just said. It seems to me, yes, he's right that Jefferson's language is often misinterpreted and used to purposes that I'm sure Jefferson would have been shocked to see his words being used for. But on the other hand, we have to recognize that there was a bit of irresponsible rhetoric that he's using in these cases. You can't always control what people are going to do with what you say, so you ought to be careful to say things that if people actually take them literally, if you don't want that to happen, then don't say those things quite that way. So I'd say, one ought to think about, Jefferson maybe ought to have thought about his rhetoric sometimes a little more than he did. I wanted to add, though, really to the discussion about Jefferson and religion, some considerations about his proposal to prohibit ministers from serving in the legislature in his proposed constitution. And it seems to me that this is a convergence of two lines of thought in Jefferson that are actually quite important to him. One of them is what I would call clustered together as anti-clericalism on the one hand, and the other would be what I would call his secularist political theory. And these have somewhat different status in his thinking, but they converge, I think, on this particular proposal. So to say a little bit about the anti-clericalism, Jefferson is one of these guys who tends to distrust institutional religion, as something people often say today. He sees the people in the churches as often self-seeking. Their goals are not really these high-minded or holy things that they claim to be seeking. And so he's oftentimes mistrustful of the proposals that the clerics put forward. Often he thinks they're attempts to further this secular interest, actually, of the church people. So that's part of what he has in mind. He also has in mind an idea that religion has stood traditionally as an enemy of enlightenment and is in danger of doing so today. In the letter to Waitman, for example, Roger Waitman, the very last reading, I think, in our whole conference, in the letter to Waitman, he speaks of monkish ignorance and superstition as enemies to knowledge of the rights of man, to the spread, he doesn't use this language, but of institutions that embody and further human dignity. And so he has a sense that there's something pernicious about some aspects of religion, and he's not eager to further those, certainly in the legislature. The other theme of his work that's relevant here is what I would call his secularist political theory, in that he has a political theory in which religion or God is not absent, but is rather remote. You might recall from the Declaration of Independence that he refers to the laws of nature and of nature's God, but nature's God is the God who makes these laws of nature, not the laws of the Bible or anything like that. So they're kind of out there, but it's not a God who's actively overseeing the operation of the world. And likewise, government is actively importantly involved with natural rights, which are an endowment from God. But again, God has endowed people with natural rights, but not sort of overlooking their natural rights. That's up to human beings to do. And this, so from Jefferson's point of view, government has no religious purpose. It has no religious purpose. And therefore, it's appropriate to keep the clerics out of the legislature because as clerics, they have no particular task to perform that is legitimate in this kind of regime. And he, as I put that together with anti-clericalism, he tends to be suspicious of what they might be wanting to promote. And I think this general line of approach also accounts for his perhaps somewhat extreme, but still his language of a wall of separation between church and state that we see in the Danbury Baptist document. Thanks.
John Bowles and Annette.
This was actually out much earlier. I was going to talk about those comments in private letters in which Jefferson said those things about a little violence now and then is a good thing. I think always with Jefferson or with any historical figure, you have to pay attention to the chronology of when things are written, and that you cannot take something that someone says in 1770 and apply it to 1820 or vice versa. People evolve, people change their minds. Jefferson is referring to Shays' Rebellion. He's in France, and he's appalled by the passivity of the French people. Here are 18 or 20 million people he thinks are incredibly badly governed. Mm-hmm. And he sees poverty and fear and desperation on the face of the people, and they don't seem to do anything about it. And he finds that extremely upsetting. So for him, in the context of France in the mid-1780s, what those rebellious farmers are doing in Massachusetts, standing up for their rights, seems so refreshing, so powerful. So that's what he's not writing these are not public papers. These are private comments to individuals in which he's expressing, he's trying to calm down their kind of hysterical reaction to Shays' Rebellion, but it just makes him feel good to see average people standing up for their rights, which he does not see in France. So I think those letters have to be seen in the sense that they're private letters. They're not meant to sort of advocate rebellion every year, and they are in the context of the passivity of the French and most European people who, in some sense, in his mind, let themselves be ruled by monarchs who only care about the monarch and not about the people. So my basic thing here is you have to pay attention to chronology. You have to pay attention to context. And that, you just cannot pull quotes or letters out and think that somehow they have some totally independent meaning. They have meaning in context and time. So.
And Ed, and then Peter.
Okay, back to this idea about Hamilton's understanding or beliefs about Great Britain as looking to the most powerful nation on earth as an example to model the United States upon, and to think about how that appeared to Jefferson. I alluded earlier this morning to the idea that he thought that the American Revolution was to do something completely different, and the question would be, why not just stay as part of Great Britain if it's so great? And if everything worked, it would make sense to stay with it. Why create a government that is like it? And Jeff Looney and I were talking at lunch about something that has not come up here when we're talking about Hamilton as a Republican, and what Madison and Jefferson know about him is that he proposed the idea of an executive that served for life and a Senate that served for life. Madison knew this. This is not something that he makes public. He's got the notes, but he certainly told Jefferson. And Jefferson actually had a copy of Madison's notes because he had his son-in-law copy it out. So these two guys, so you can imagine Jefferson, after we've gone through this revolution, he comes back from France, and he finds out that this is what is proposed. So what seems hysterical, I mean, he can write, Hamilton can say, I'm a Republican, I can believe all of these things, but Jefferson and Madison know that he has proposed wouldn't be a monarchy in the sense it was hereditary, but the idea of having a person who could serve, a president who could serve for life, and a Senate that serves for life is basically, it's a monarchical system in the sense that you have a House of Lords version of that, and a monarch. That's what Jefferson sees. So the kind of hysteria and the concern about Hamilton comes from his knowledge of what it is that he has proposed. So he can say that he's a Republican, and he could be a type of republicanism that he believed in, but you can also understand how Jefferson and Madison, and particularly Jefferson, would go through the roof upon hearing the monocrat, this idea of one-person rule and a House of Lords, that this is what he wanted for the United States, and says this and is obviously rejected, but this is something that they know, and it's not something that they make, that they trumpet, but Jefferson definitely knows this because Madison has told him. Well, Madison gives him a copy. He's got his own copy of Madison's notes.
Peter, then Colleen.
The problem here is what does the word republic mean? Two questions to keep in mind. One is the instability of the term itself, and then the radical uncertainty about whether it could possibly succeed. There's a minimal definition of republic current in this period, is if you have any sort of popular representation, even if very limited, it crosses the threshold and becomes a republic. Britain was often described, the United Kingdom, as a royal republic. And when you think of Britain as a republic, and it actually makes sense in terms of your defining regime types, then Hamilton looks awfully close to that. Jefferson's conception of republicanism, I think there are two things to keep in mind. One, it is progressive, that is, it's unfolding. We don't even know exactly what form it will take, and that's why his constitutionalism is dynamic and democratic and progressive, because we'll outgrow the Constitution that we draft for ourselves right now. Jefferson's definition of republicanism, because it is progressive, is aspirational, is a question of faith. And I think this gets us over into discussions of religion. That is, if we have competing faiths, the regime is in danger. And the idea of institutions, and picking up on Mike's point about anti-clericalism, and institutional churches are propagators of a particular faith and then can determine in the way its followers will behave in public and so forth. This is imperium in imperio, government within a government. It's dangerous. He's hostile to corporations for the same reason, because these are not republics, they're anti-republics. But the best way to think about Jefferson and religion is to think over the long term, getting past the famous period of disestablishment, church and state, the wall of separation, to the way he thinks about religion in his older life. And for those of you who don't know Jefferson, I'll offer his infamous prediction that every young man in America one day will be a Unitarian. Now, why does he think Unitarianism will triumph? It's precisely because of what he thinks is happening in the religious life of America in his time. This is an extraordinary and perverse interpretation, but Jefferson, in surprising ways, is sympathetic to the development of the Second Great Awakening in America because of the popular thrust of religious mobilization, which will create, what I'm going to suggest is that Jefferson has a conception of a republicanized religion that will sustain the faith. Think of the way he uses the word creed to refer to basic Republican principles. It has to be a faith because it's an experiment. We don't know how it works out, but if you don't believe in it, it won't happen. So that belief is really important. He thinks that increasingly, and as for those clergymen serving in the Virginia legislature, that's okay with him later on, because many of them are his supporters. And he says, you know, once the danger of establishment, a illegitimate church-state relationship is finally defeated, then we don't have to be fearful of these people. Instead, he increasingly thinks of what he used to call the priestcraft, and the priest is a dangerous quasi-aristocratic caste promoting its own interests. These are, in fact, leaders of the people who, within these voluntary associations, the churches, because of their merit, because they are rewarded for being efficacious preachers, will gain the support of their congregations. The congregational form of government is very important to him. But they will gain adherence because they speak to the real concerns of the people. They will speak to popular morality or the vernacular ethics, the way to live in the world, but a way to live in the world that's grounded in faith, and the faith is finally in the Republican project. To sustain. Meanwhile, of course, many people are Trinitarians, but one of the things you could observe about the Second Great Awakening and about American Christianity in general since then is that doctrinal tests are not all that important. It's really a question of whether you're with us or against us. Are you going to join the church? The disciples of Christ, he thinks, are very attractive because they downplay tests of faith. It's you learn about religion and how it succeeds on the ground, the way it performs. And he asks his correspondents in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at Harvard College, to send Unitarian missionaries to Virginia, where they will be denied the pulpits because, of course, the most retarded, unenlightened people are those people who hold on to the delusion of the church as a form of a regressive, reactionary bastion of their position. Instead, come preach in the fields. Field preachers. Can you imagine your local Unitarian pastor, and most of you don't have one because there are so few of them out there, You're not going to find many of them doing field preaching. But again, it seems silly on the face of it, but what Jefferson is getting at is the democratization of American Christianity. And I mean that in a double sense, both that the people generally are drawn to, mobilized by Christianity in a way that's very similar to the mobilization of the American Revolution itself, but also a democratic ecclesiology in which the people are governing. It's almost like New England towns. Jefferson has a vision of a civil society emerging in which the real work of education, and education for so many people is education and practical ethics, is taking place in churches all over the country. They compete with each other. It's like a market in a benign sense, thinking of commerce in a positive sense. All the information circulating, all the comparisons and the competition are going to lead to, and this is the end point of my harangue, my sermon even, is that America is imminently becoming a Christian nation, not in the sense that we talk about Christian nation today, but a nation infused with faith in their own regime, the fundamental principles of Republican government. And that's not just the Republican form of government for itself. It's a prayer for the future of the country and its immortality, and for the rising generations to come, the young people out there in the audience today. This is what it's all about. This is what Jefferson in his old age is praying for. This is why he's so intensely religious himself in a way that we don't recognize as religious. It's because he imagines Christianity and democracy and republicanism merging, and that this will be the solid ground for the success of the Republican experiment in America.
Colleen, Andrew, Carson, and Brad.
Well, that was a great example of the field clergy whipping up his flock in the field here, Peter.
Yeah, watch out, it's a steep grade, you might fall off.
You keep us all awake, and you do it so well. I just wanted to comment very briefly, because I think we're sort of past that on the religion question, but that Andrew asked about Madison. For Madison, one of the reasons he doesn't talk about these things quite so much is because, and Brad said rightly that Philip Muniz has done excellent work on this, but the whole idea of freedom of conscience, which for Madison is the first right, the first of all our freedoms, he was so disappointed that that didn't get in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Is that mine doing this buzzing? I don't think so. I heard something beeping. I hear it too. Maybe it doesn't want me to talk.
I hear it too.
So that the problem is with a universal religion in the modern world, and then the move towards universal monarchy that you see all through Europe during this period, it's a real danger to not only religious liberty but civil liberty. In order to have civil liberty, you have to have religious liberty. And Madison is very, very aware of that, and so wants to go to lengths to make sure that both our civil and religious liberty is protected. But it'd be interesting to do a comparison of his memorial and remonstrance with Jefferson's Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty. Are they based on the same idea, or are there some important differences? So if there are any students out there interested in I think what would be a very interesting project, there it is. I wanted to just take up very briefly this little rebellion now and then, because I think it's not only pushing anarchy, but what Jefferson's actually trying to do something important for free people, and that is to recur to first principles. You know, how do we do that? That might not be the best way to do it, but we do need from time to time to recur to first principles. Otherwise, we lose them. We forget what they are, even. And so I want to disrupt things a little bit right now in the spirit of Jefferson, and Steve can stop me. But I want to ask this question. I want to ask it of our panelists, but also of everybody here, because this is a question for all of us. What were their first principles, these fellows we've been looking at? And are these our first principles today? is for example, the polarization that we see facing our nation today, what's being called a war, a battle, over two Americas, or at least two constitutions. Is this battle essentially over whether to keep or reject, to keep or leave behind that old Constitution and Declaration of Independence and that 18th century worldview of natural law and natural rights? Because the one thing that they all agree on, we talked about this yesterday, is this conception that there is such a thing as human nature, which is part of a greater nature, that has certain precepts by which we must live in order to really be human. And that's why for Jefferson, when he says the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, but that will to be rightful must be reasonable, because the minority have their equal rights, which equal law must protect. Or why Madison says there's a distinction between a factious majority and a just majority. You can only make these distinctions if there's some kind of standard higher than mere human will, more higher than just our desires or gut feelings or something like that. And of course, that's part of what's going on today, the battle, whether we still hold these truths or not. And so I just wonder if part of that battle today, really, one way to phrase it, there are lots of ways to phrase it, is whether, I mean, if we recur to first principles and we reconsider these questions, what is it that we want to do as a people? Can we continue? Are we a people, or is there any way to preserve us in this mission that was once America, and is it still America today?
We have about 15 minutes before we turn to the audience for questions, and I have half of the group on the queue. So if everybody takes 2 minutes, let me read the list. Andrew, Carson, Brad, Michael, John Ricosta, Doug, and Annette. So Andrew, and then Carson.
I wanted to pick up on Carson's thread about Hamilton and God, and Carson mentioned that great quote Hamilton has where he says, "The progress of the Jews has been and is entirely out of the ordinary course of human affairs," and he concludes that it's part of a, quote, "great providential plan." And so there are other places where I think we can see a similar kind of sentiment from Hamilton, one in the readings where, a reading from the first session when he's writing about the Louisiana Purchase. And he says that basically we didn't pull off Louisiana because of any kind of diplomatic savvy. It was because of the, quote, "interposition of an overruling providence." And there's another document I'll mention that's not in our readings from Hamilton's teenage years on St. Croix, where there's a catastrophic hurricane that brutalizes the Eastern Caribbean, and its eye passes directly over Hamilton's island. And he writes this poetic description of the storm that's published in a local newspaper. And this document has gotten a lot of attention from historians because the locals were so impressed by his precocious facility with language that that they raised money to send him to America, and he ends up going to King's College, and from there, we know the rest of the story. And so because of the effect of this document, historians have focused on that aspect of it, and I think sometimes they overlook the substance of what he actually wrote about the storm, and it's very much a description of a vengeful God who is punishing humans for their sins. And that's what he sees as the root of the storm. And so I think if you read all of these documents in tandem, I think there's an argument to be made that Hamilton does not subscribe to some kind of deistic clockmaker type of God, but a God who is very much intervening in the course of human events.
Carson, then Brad.
Okay. Steve suggested we can pose questions to our fellow panelists, so I'll pose one to Michael Zuckert, but to anybody else, and of course on the understanding that anybody who wants to can totally ignore this question. But Michael knows a lot more about Jefferson than I do, and I just wonder whether Jefferson involved himself in a bit of a contradiction when he proposed excluding clergy from service in the legislature. You see a kind of simple and defensible consistency in Madison, if I recall Madison correctly, because he held this position that the government should take no cognizance of religion, and therefore clergy can serve in the legislature because the government looks at you as a clergyman and says, I don't see a clergyman, I just see a citizen. In the bill on establishing religious freedom, Jefferson says, our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions any more than our opinions in physics or geometry. Therefore, the prescribing of any citizen is unworthy of the public confidence by laying upon him an incapacity, being called to offices of trust and emolument unless he profess or renounce this or that religious opinion, is depriving him injuriously of those privileges and advantages to which, in common with his fellow citizens, he has a natural right. Now, I admit immediately and obviously that there's a difference between professing opinions and being a member of the clergy, but still Jefferson says a lot when he says that ordinarily your admission to public office is a matter of natural right. That's a big hump to get over. So I just wonder if there's an inconsistency in his thought on this question.
Brad, and then providentially, Michael.
I wanted to come back to Annette's point about Madison and Jefferson's opposition to Hamilton, in part because of his proposal of a president for life at the Constitutional Convention. A couple of things about that. Hamilton, it's not exactly a president for life, in the same way that we don't appoint judges for life.
Well, on good behavior.
There's, in his plan, there is an impeachment proposal as well, so the president could be impeached for bad behavior. But there's a kind of a fun fact involved here. When Hamilton is asked, I think in 1800, Doug, you can correct me if I'm wrong, one of his Federalist friends writes him and says, man, we're being hammered. We are being hammered by the Republicans because of this rumor that you at the Constitutional Convention proposed a monarchy or something like it. And could you please say something about this? And he says, even if what you said is something that, causes trouble for us, it's okay. We just want to clarify for the public what you actually did. Hamilton writes back and says, okay, here's what I said at the convention. Yes, I did argue for the president for life. He says, but what I want to, he says, first of all, we have, as Peter mentioned, it's not clear, we're not all agreed on what the meaning of republicanism is. We can argue about that. He said, I think what I proposed was compatible with republicanism. And he says, in fact, my proposal for a president for life was voted on, and one of the delegations that voted in favor of it was Virginia. And who was in the Virginia delegation at that time? James Madison. And he says, so if I'm insufficiently Republican, so is James Madison.
Michael, then John Rogasta.
Okay. I will try to respond to Carson.
You got two.
This is providential, all right. He must have known what I was going to say.
Shot.
This one doesn't work. No, they're all. Oh, they're all. Oh, okay. I can see. With regard to what the challenge Carson proposed to me, it seems to me clear, one, that Jefferson probably understood there was a problem with what he was proposing, suggested by Peter's observation earlier that he backed away from this proposal in his later thinking. He doesn't exactly defend backing away, but he seems to have thought it. So let's admit at the outset that there is some kind of problem, some kind of tension here. But I think Jefferson could give a kind of response to that by saying, well, what the protection of religion amounts to, what the protection for, especially something like free exercise of religion, what that amounts to is protection for an individual's freedom to practice and believe whatever it is they practice and believe about religion, and that the protection. We're there. We're leaking. Man, nice. All right.
That's got a good beat.
Once they're done flashing, you
Doesn't
can
it?
get the power for decade.
Okay. Anyway, I'm going to just keep talking. So Jefferson, I think, could say to himself, look, this is not a violation of the protection of religious freedom because we're not violating anybody's rights to practice religion as they wish unless their religion requires them to serve in the legislature, which probably wouldn't accept as a legitimate reason. Well, and we're not affecting, now it's good?
Yeah.
Okay. And we're not affecting their religious beliefs. So he would say this is, if it's a kind of violation, if it's a kind of impinging on religious freedom, it's not really impinging on what the core of religious freedom is. We're not telling anybody how to practice their religion or anything like that. But I actually wanted to get on the queue to try my hand at a very brief and I hope and I know concise statement of what might be, at least I think, is the core of the position of these two and where they come to disagree, like in 5 sentences or less. So one, I would say, and I'm going to do it at the level of talking about their political thought rather than other aspects of their action and thinking that one could reasonably also identify. But it seems to me that as political thinkers, both Hamilton and Jefferson are in that broad tradition of 17th, 18th, early 19th century political thought that we sometimes come to call early modern liberalism. That kind of political thinking that was common, that John Locke pioneered, but that many, many others at this era, most of the Americans who were writing about politics at this period, endorsed in some version or other. But I would say that one of the things, and to take the Declaration of Independence as a very fine statement of that political philosophy, I would identify the passage in the Declaration that says, in order to secure these rights, having identified natural rights in the previous sentence, in order to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And I would say in that little partial sentence, or part of a sentence, we find the core commitments of each of the two. For Hamilton, it's to secure these rights, and the securing is the thing that gets his most attention and most effort in all of his career. Whereas for Jefferson, it's that requirement of the consent of the governed as an active and real thing, not just nothing passive about it. That's a consent that actually reflects the living opinions and commitments of the living generation. And so many of the things that he proposes and supports are of that character. And so it's the security theme versus the ongoing and realistic consent theme that I think perhaps captures the difference between them in a very comprehensive way, as well as anything else that I could think of.
John Ragosta, and then Annette.
You know, I had to say something about Peter saying that we are becoming a Christian nation and Jefferson's okay with that. I felt a tremor from down below at that suggestion. Now, you know, of course, Peter explains that by saying that faith in our own regime, the immortality of the nation, the importance of young people for the growth of all that, which is to say that Peter and Jefferson tend to use English words in ways that no mere mortals can, and define them in a different way than most of us would. Jefferson, you know, is certainly not, he continues to maintain his concern about church and state even into his old age. That never changes. His point about Christianity and the Second Great Awakening, he says that Christianity, he says, look, we're a Christian people in the sense that the majority of people in America would say, if asked, we're Christian. And he says, by the way, that's good. But the reason why he says that's good, which I think is what's really important, and I think partially implicit in what Peter is saying, is because Christianity demands not only that you love your neighbor, but that you love your enemy. And if we're going to live in a country with very different people, very different ethnic backgrounds, very different nationalities, very different religious backgrounds, very different political views, the lesson that you all have to get along is why Christianity is good for a republic. But certainly, you know, in the formation of the University of Virginia, he is adamant about separation of church and state. He eventually, because he's worried about funding, he's going to lose his funding if he doesn't say you can have church services somewhere. He and Madison initially say, well, they can have churches on campus, and as soon as they get the funding, they start saying adjacent to campus. And then he says you can have church services in the rotunda, but as long as he's alive, no one is allowed to have church services in the rotunda. They try, and Jefferson says, no, we're not going to permit that. So his commitment to separation of church and state is central and never dissipates. Very quickly touching on Colleen's point, because I think it is important. What is the consensus in America? You know, are there first principles? It strikes me as extremely important that, you know, not to wave the flag a little bit too much, but that the Declaration and the Constitution continue to be central to every American. You don't find anybody politically. The birthright citizenship debate may be the one exception to that coming up now. Nobody says, you know, the Constitution's wrong. The Democrats say we love the Constitution. The Republicans say we love the Constitution. Nobody challenges the Declaration. And when you think about originalism, and I'm thinking about Scalia's Matters of Interpretation, which I usually don't cite Scalia, but there's an excellent book in which he really tries to explain why originalism makes sense. There was a moment when the American people, and I'll disagree with Morgan, I had to remind Morgan, you know, inventing the people, it's all a myth to talk about the people. Well, no, it's not a myth. There was a moment when people got together, and sure, there were dissidents, and sure, there were loyalists, but we, the people, decided on a declaration. We, the people, in spite of all the opposition, in spite of the fights for ratification, we chose this Constitution. And so while we have very radically different concepts about what that Constitution means today, what that Declaration means today when it says all men are created equal, we still have this core that we can turn back to when people said, okay, we all agree on that. And I think that that's where Scalia, when he's making more sense, his book, by the way, makes much more sense than his opinions, but when he's making sense, what he's trying to describe in originalism.
And that gets the final word on this part of the panel, and then we move to audience questions.
Oh, wow. Ugh, pressure. Back to Colleen's point as well, this question of first principles. And one thing that I think we have to keep in mind is that we're talking about the Constitution as if it's just about these particular people at this particular time. There was a war, and there were 3 amendments to the Constitution, 13th, 14th, and 15th, and particularly the 14th Amendment has transformed American life. The modern world that we live under, the world we live under, is a result of those amendments. And so this is not Madison, it's not those people. We have other founders whose names that we don't even know, who have transformed society in a way that and has made us who we are today. So we have to think about what are first principles. Are they the first principles just of the 1780s or the 18th century? Are they first principles of the 19th century, the middle of the 19th century, when the country tried to remake itself? Didn't go as well during Reconstruction, but then when people pick this up back in the 20th century, they don't go back to 1789, 1788. That's not what they're talking about. They use the 14th Amendment as a vehicle for having the Second American Revolution, along with the Declaration. The Declaration and the 14th Amendment are seen, the Declaration is seen as informing the spirit of the 14th Amendment, and that is the amendment. Those are the amendments that have helped to make modern America.
Thank you. If you have a question, step up to a microphone. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I am a fourth-year student at UVA, and I study women and gender studies and government, which is relevant to my question. So I kind of wanted to go off number 9, which I don't think we got to today, and go in a more pointed direction, so discussing honor and masculinity in that sense. So, sorry, I wrote the question on my phone. So I think in a lot of literature, we see the fundamental connection between the founding of America and patriarchy. The book, The Internal Enemy, for example, discusses the role patriarchal values and its resulting notion of racial superiority created the basic argument for the subjugation of African Americans in the sense that white men need to somehow teach and socialize the black population. I think in another example, based off the book Fighting for American Manhood, we see concepts of honor, patriarchy, and masculinity playing a vital role in America's decision to wage war against the Spanish in the late 19th century. So I have 2 questions. First, to what extent do you think Jefferson and/or Hamilton embody 18th century masculinity, and how important was it to their politics? And second, how do you think these patriarchal and fundamentally masculine values written into our founding documents have influenced the trajectory of our nation?
Joanne?
Yeah, that is a big question. Certainly, I think that if you're an 18th century gentleman who's very worried about your honor, you are someone who is thinking constantly about your reputation, your manhood, your masculinity are kind of all bound up in one big bundle of angst. You know, I think a lot of the political elite in this period, in different ways, and certainly Jefferson and Hamilton are doing this in very different ways, but generally they were thinking about their reputations as public figures, as political figures, as leaders. Yesterday we talked a little bit about adding in the complication of being a slaveholder on top of that, and that also involves manhood. So, I mean, I think they were concerned about that in different ways. Hamilton, and for some of the reasons that others have brought up, you know, has this troubled beginning and is hypersensitive about any attempt to slap at his reputation, which in his mind, I think, as I just suggested, sort of manhood and reputation and honor are kind of one big bundle, which is part of why, you know, over the course of his life, he gets involved in 10 near duels before he gets involved in the final one. But what's interesting, the policy angle to that is really interesting, because people often look at his final unfortunate duel and they say, oh, well, you know, he was in this sort of dark religious phase, and his son had been killed in a duel, and he was feeling, I quoted him saying, this American world was not made for me, that the duel was a kind of political suicide. Well, what's interesting is he talks about national honor very much like he talks about personal honor, and at one point he says, not to defend one's national honor is to commit political suicide. So he very much is thinking about the nation in that same kind of way. It's a really good question, because I think that doesn't feel like it goes very deep, but I think it goes very deep as to how he's understanding America's reputation on the world stage.
Thank you.
Any other responses to that question? Okay, we'll go to this microphone, and then we'll be back to you.
We've been talking about Jefferson on church and state, and I wanted to bring up a great document that probably not widely known that either adds information or complicates it. But there's a great letter that Jefferson writes early in his retirement when somebody sends him a pamphlet and he gets excited about it and writes back. And Jefferson writes on the subject of clergy preaching about politics from the pulpit. And he basically says, no, clergy can't speak about politics from the pulpit, and the reasons are interesting. He says, it's okay for a clergyman to have an opinion about politics. They can talk about it somewhere else, but not in the pulpit. And the reason is that it's a breach of contract. They were hired to talk about religion in the pulpit, so they shouldn't be up there talking about politics in the pulpit, which is kind of strange, but that's the argument. And I thought, you know, it helps explain, I think, why it might be okay later, at least in his mind, for a clergyman to serve in the legislature, because that's not, you know, violating what they were up there supposedly doing. It's not mixing them up in quite the same way. And just as a sidelight on that, Jefferson writes this letter, and then he gets to the bottom of it, and he says, P.S., in effect, on further reflection, I realized I don't know this guy who wrote this letter at all, so I'm not going to risk this response to him. So instead, I wrote him the following, and the following is, Dear Sir, thanks for the pamphlet. You know.
Yes.
Hello. First of all, thank you all so much for being here. It has been a true honor and pleasure to hear you all speak. Some of you, including Drs. Gordon Reed and Bowles, have brought up the issue of historians and non-historians alike using the judgments that our present American society has informed to either promote or degrade the characters of those of the past. Washington and Jefferson have been primary recipients of such criticism. My question is, do you all think that Jefferson and other figures of this period generally get a fair shake from your colleagues and current publicized mainstream American political thought?
Peter?
No.
Peter and then Michael. And then Colleen.
Oh, no, was that my answer?
Peter,
Yeah.
Michael, and Colleen.
It's a great question. If we could cut back on the celebration and cut back on the condemnation and try to make sense of people in their own time, because that is relevant to us. That's the reason we do history. Then we could move forward with them. We're right at a moment here locally where Jefferson's tottering on his pedestal, and a big push might come along and he'd smash to the ground, and that would be regrettable, deeply regrettable. You can't banish the past, and you have to see yourself in it, because we're implicated. That doesn't mean it's a prison. Jefferson preached against the dead hand of the past, but he did want to be remembered because he tried to engage with the problems of his own time. I have mixed feelings about this. Generally, I'd say the civic revival that I think we're in the midst of and that you young people exemplify is a great thing. For it to be focused, it needs to draw inspiration from all our history. The multiple foundings, as Annette suggests. It's not just one moment. In fact, this is what distinguishes Jefferson from other founders. He thinks in terms of refounding across the generations. And if you honor him for being part of a first founding, fine. He wants to be remembered. I was a member of that generation, he writes, and they deserve all due honor, but they don't have all the answers. I think it's up to you. I think we have at hand the information we need. We have the insights we need. What we need is citizen engagement. I'm not saying studying history is the answer to everything, but I think it's a great way to get clear about where we are now, because we live in fog, a fog that we generate, a fog of too much information, of too much nonsense. And trying to understand what happened in this period is something, as we've been doing for the last couple of days, is, I think, a civic exercise, an exercise both in listening, talking and listening, and in modesty. Modesty before the subject we're encountering, modesty about our own capacity to understand it fully. I think that's the threshold of good citizenship. And in this sense, I endorse the study of the founding with those ideas in mind.
Michael, then Colleen.
Yeah, there we go. It seems there's a kind of prior issue involved in your question, which is, what should history be trying to do? History as a study, as a discipline. So there's a view about history that became very prominent in the 19th century, that history should be, in our language, value-free, in effect, that history should just try to tell us how it was, and not make judgments about it, and recognize the foreignness of the past, and not presume, really, to stand in judgment over it. And then there's the alternative view that what is the point of studying history other than to learn something from it that might, among other things, be of some use to us. And I think that was the way in which history was understood when it first emerged as a discipline, and it seems to have come back as an important way of looking at history as well. And in that second way, it seems to me that learning to make judgments, or making judgments, and learning the proper criteria for making judgments about people and actions in the past is an important part of what we do and what we ought to do. And so the question is, what kind of criteria would be appropriate for making judgments of, say, a Jefferson or a Washington, I think is the example that you used. It seems to me that there are two issues that we ought to pay attention to here. One is to hesitate to think of persons and actions in global terms, as if somebody does something which, from our perspective, or from, even if we would be happy to say, a universalistic perspective of some sort, if somebody committed some error or some even sin according to that we should therefore dismiss the importance or even perhaps the virtues of that person for this particular thing. Sometimes, yes. Sometimes there are things that are important enough that we would feel, I think, that we would do that. At least I have a tendency to think sometimes we would do that. But one of the things that I remember importantly, that Abraham Lincoln often said, is that practices that were universally practiced at some time in the past, you've got to give weight to the force of that universality of that practice. And I think Lincoln suggested a dual attitude toward that. On the one hand, we are perfectly within our rights to say this practice was not a good practice. John Locke talks, for example, about the Incas in Peru who raised children to eat them. Now that seems pretty out there, and we're not likely to approve of that practice. And there are other practices, slavery, they're closer to home. Slavery, patriarchalism, Jefferson wanted his daughters raised very differently from the way he'd want a son raised, things like that. But I think what Lincoln would say is there are practices that were universal, and we condemn the practice, we try to find better practices, but we shouldn't necessarily condemn all the individuals who lived at that time who participated in that practice. That's the way people live. People live according to the mores, the norms, the institutions of the time in which they live. So I think keeping that distinction in mind gives us a little bit of help in trying to make judgments about what kind of praise and blame we should, from our distance, from our perspective, give to people of the past.
Colleen and then Annette.
Thanks for that great question. We live in a country whose central idea is the idea that all men are created equal. So equality is our probably first principle. But we've come to understand it in a very different way today than I think was originally intended. And in the name of equality, today we practice a politics of superiority. And if you're a straight white male, you are a bit contemptuous in many respects to many people in society today. And so it's the opposite of a practice of respecting our brothers and sisters. And we also practice a politics of superiority in terms of our own time, just assuming that there's been a progress, that we have these things figured out better than any other time in the past. And maybe that's true, but maybe it isn't. Maybe it's a question worth asking, a question that we should keep alive. I think Peter's exactly right that we're in need of practicing a little bit more a politics of modesty or humiliation, and also a politics of moderation, and to keep open the question of whether, well, Coolidge once said, if I can quote Coolidge for the first time in this conference, when he was talking about the founding and talking about the possibility of progress, beyond that, because in response to something John said earlier, I think very much there is actually a battle in the country today over the founding. I mean, it isn't always termed that way, but it comes from the early progressive movement that is still in many ways alive. That's a direct that's meant to replace the founding with a very different, very radically different understanding of politics and how we should live our lives. And at least for Coolidge, he said, there was this thing called the Declaration of Independence, and that was final, by which he meant there was something about those teachings, and I like the way Annette expressed this earlier, that it might be that we got it right, and that what we need to do is not replace that as much as live up to it. At least that's a question worth considering.
Annette?
I speak primarily to Jefferson, although this applies to Washington as well. I don't know that it's so much of people getting a bad rap now, a worse rap. I think what has happened is more of a correction in the sense that we went through a period of extreme founder worship, hagiographic portrayals of Jefferson, I would say, attributing things to him that he never said himself, that he was the foremost, greatest abolitionist in American history, that kind of thing. And historians are writing about the founding in a different kind of way. What we've had, because of the opening of society, the differing understanding about who can participate, who can write history, who can do various things, we have more stories. And the problem is not just with the founders, with anybody. The more you know about people, the more you find out, the harder it is to have a kind of celebrity hero worship type attitude about them. You can still admire them, which I think is a much more mature way of, for me, of dealing with them, to see the people's strengths and their weaknesses, to claim to love somebody and celebrate somebody, but you don't really want to know about them. I don't want to know that about, I don't want to know too much about you, is sort of a questionable thing. So I think what's happening now is more of a correction, and I agree with the statement that Michael was saying with Lincoln, is that history is a moral enterprise. You don't just say, and here's where they slaughter the innocents and move on. You are naturally, as a human being, going to make some sorts of judgments, and I think you should say that this practice is not great, because if you carry that to an extreme, then what is the point of just writing, and then they did this, and then they did that? There is a moral component to it, but I do think that you have to have a balance, that you don't just take the mistakes that people made or the way mistakes that we characterize, people not going against their community, going against their society, as Michael said, and most people live within the terms of the society that they're born in. Now, it turns out that Jefferson bucked that in one way by becoming a revolutionary, and in other things, developing a different attitude about religion, those kinds of things, but was not able to do that with slavery. I mean, at least intellectually he did it, but not personally, he didn't move against the institution in the forceful way that he did with respect to other things. But it's kind of extraordinary that he made himself into what he made himself, given the way he was born. He could have been, remained in his community, remained with their attitudes, become a loyalist, whatever. But he struck out on that particular way to have to take a different path. So I think what we're going through now, sort of the growing pains of what happens when more people get to participate in the story, bring different aspects to it, and then the situation looks much more complicated and not as necessarily rosy as the way people had presented it before.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Juan Hernandez, a senior from Hamilton College. Thank you again for coming here to make such a distinguished, excellent discussion. So I guess this question is inspired by Professor Paquette after our freedom discussion yesterday. And I was just wondering, specifically with Thomas Jefferson, if any of you would like to comment on his idea of diffusion when it comes to slavery, and how maybe that could relate with the history of the Old South. The Old South?
Diffusion. Well, I'll say something. Well, I mean, the idea, Peter has referred to this before, that Jefferson had sort of a New England envy. His thinking was, and it seems craziest to us now because we know what happened, again, we're looking back at this, is that if enslaved people, you look at New England, where were the places that had gradual emancipation or immediate emancipation before? There are places where there are not a lot of black people. In places where, where the population is not huge. And the thinking is that if you created those conditions other places, eventually whites would not mind, would be more likely to enact emancipation statutes than in a situation where we said yesterday, where it's 40% black people, or a majority in South Carolina. So that's the idea, is that they're spread out and then emancipation would be much more likely. And I think it is a crazy notion because you spread slavery and then slavery spreads. That's what happens. But the thinking is he knows something. Here's the thing. Jefferson knows white people. Jefferson understands race in a way that is, it makes him a sort of a non-palatable, subject area in some ways, but he understands that there's fear, and numbers matter. The more black people are in a particular place, the more frightened whites are going to be. And so the idea is spread them out, but obviously it doesn't work.
I just add to that, the idea of diffusion is also associated with, for Jefferson, with knowledge. And what is required of future generations, and take this to heart because you're a young person, is that you will be able to think things that were not thinkable. You will be more enlightened than we were. Yeah, I know, that's dodgy. But if the United States of America represents something new under the sun, and if it is a progressive society in which people become increasingly conscious not only of their own rights, but of other people's rights, because of course that's the same thing, and if that knowledge is diffused by the radical spread of knowledge through village schools, through churches, across the countryside, less fearful slave owners will be able to see a light which is occluded to them in the midst of the masses of slaves in Virginia in Jefferson's time. So that's the prayer. It's absurd because Annette put her finger on the fundamental problem. It's based on a notion of demography in which population is zero-sum. And you can spread it as a kind of social engineer, and then good things will happen. But instead, as the early censuses soon demonstrated, the more you spread population, the very amelioration of condition of the slaves, which is predicted by diffusionists, is what's going to lead to more reproduction. The scariest thing about American, it's not a scary thing, the most notable aspect of North American slavery is the natural reproduction of the population, completely different, as you know, from conditions in the West Indies.
Kevin.
Well, I just want to add one caveat to these last couple of comments. In his book, The Road to Secession, Secessionists at Bay, 1776 to 1854, William Freeling shows that deep Southern nationalists, people who wanted secession partly because they wanted to insulate slavery from Northern political power, were fearful that if secession were put off too long, it would be less likely that the more northerly slave states would secede. And when secession actually came in 1860 and 61, 4 slave states didn't secede. Now you could say, well, Maryland would have if they could have. Okay, maybe. But that means 3 slave states didn't secede. Why? Well, the argument that immediate secessionists have been making for over a decade was Delaware and Kentucky and Missouri are having a declining share of slave population over time, and they're going to be less likely to be committed to slavery, and in fact may even abolish slavery as the states immediately to their north did. So I think actually if one thinks of Jefferson as trying to decide how to get rid of slavery in the United States generally, this diffusion idea doesn't make any sense. But if one sees him as thinking about Virginia's future, then the diffusion idea makes a lot more sense.
I agree.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Or you want to say something?
Yeah.
Sir, we've got time. We've got time for your question.
One more question. Howard Morgan, Hamilton College alum and director of the Alexander Hamilton Institute. I wanted to touch on or ask in the context of George Washington stepping down as president, which to me seems like a critical moment. No matter what we wrote in the Constitution, if he stayed on for life, it would have played out very differently. And one of the readings was certainly Alexander Hamilton's comments or revisions on his farewell address. But what I've never really heard is, what behind-the-scenes role did Hamilton play? Was he in favor of it or against it? Did Hamilton ultimately have ambitions to be president? It's certainly inferred in the musical. Or people thought he might. And, I guess Jefferson's resigning from the cabinet also sort of stimulated this, and it was clearly he had ambition. But maybe you can talk behind the scenes, what was going on there as the first, non-revolutionary transfer of power took place.
If anybody can answer that in 45 seconds, they can have the floor.
Menti, do it.
Joanne?
45 seconds. Okay. Hamilton behind the scenes was trying to put off Washington's announcement that he would step down, because as soon as he announced it, everyone would be trying to become president or thinking about the presidency. So behind the scenes, that's one of the things that he was doing. Your second question was?
Well, if he wanted to be president.
Oh, no, I don't think he wanted to be president, and I don't think even if he wanted to, he could have been, but he was very blunt about saying over and over again, kind of relates to what we were saying before, I'm not popular, there's no way I would be in that position. So I don't actually think he ever expected that.
You got
Let
10
me,
seconds.
let me, first of all, thank all of you for being here for the last 3 days, participating in this. And please join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion. And before I turn the floor over to Bob Paquette, Doug Ambrose has asked for a second to say something.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody who put this together, Andrew and Mary Scott Fleming and all the staff here and down at Monticello and the Omni and everything. But I especially want to thank two people in particular. One is Carl Menges, whose material generosity is, if possible, surpassed by his heart and his love of learning, which is a constant source of inspiration to all of us who know him. The other person is Bob Paquette. As many of you know, Bob is leaving Hamilton. Doesn't want to say retiring, but all the wonderful students here who have asked these wonderful questions are in our Old South class. And this is the last class that Bob is teaching at Hamilton. And I've been privileged to teach with him since I came to Hamilton in 1990. And ever since I came there, he's been my mentor and friend and my big brother, who has been my harshest critic, but my most loyal supporter and protector. He's a man who's inspired me with his intellectual courage and his intellectual integrity, but he's inspired me most by his dedication to students, to his commitment to make them better writers, better thinkers. And it's been a real privilege to be associated with him. And Hamilton will be a poorer place without Bob Paquette. The good news is that, as evidenced by this weekend, he's going to continue to be someone who's inspiring us to keep thinking about things rigorously, evaluating evidence fairly, and coming to logical, rational arguments regarding that stuff. I owe him a debt I will never be able to repay, and I just wanted to thank him for all that he's given to me and to the students of Hamilton College.
I also want to thank Steve Ely for doing a masterful job. I want to bring up Andrew, my good friend, who has a few words to say, and I think he wants to get a group picture of the panelists, you know, at a good location. So, Andrew, you want to have a few words?
Actually, I was going to say that in the introduction to this panel, a number of you asked about Montalto and the history of it. We acquired this property in 2004, and we paid exactly the same amount of money for it as the Louisiana land purchase. It was 15 million for 40 acres. And we purchased it because it was about to be bought by property developers, and we had this vision of mansions being tiered down this hill overlooking Monticello. So we bought it for exactly the same reason as Jefferson bought it, to protect our view shed. This was his first acquisition of property. He bought it in 1771, although the purchase took several years as he paid in installments during the American Revolution. He never built a building up here. It was bad enough at Monticello. No one had built that high in America. This would have been unfeasible. He did, though, think of having an obelisk up here just for the, once again, for the view. And about 10 years ago, we started to convert this building, thanks to Robert H. Smith, and we've turned it into our conference center. But let me join and say how grateful we are to Bob. I hope we'll be partners in crime again. It's great fun. For sure. And it's been what Jefferson would call a feast of reason. It was. Thank you very much.